Hello friends. Welcome back to Story for Night Sleep. Before the story starts, you can share in the comments where you're listening from tonight. I love reading them. Now, make sure your lights are turned off. Get into a comfortable position and let your body relax. Now let's begin. Story 1. Some places don't feel haunted. They don't announce themselves with cold drafts or slamming doors. They don't whisper names in the dark or leave visible marks behind. They simply feel aware, as if they are listening, as if they are waiting for something specific. I used to think that feeling was imagination, a side effect of memory, of returning somewhere you once belonged and no longer do. I know better now. Because imagination doesn't explain why some places feel different the moment you step inside them. Before anything happens, before anything moves, it doesn't explain how a building can feel like it recognizes you. This is not a story about a monster. It's not a story about a ghost in the traditional sense. No rattling chains, no pale figures drifting through hallways. This is a story about a house. And what happens when a house remembers you more clearly than you remember yourself? I hadn't planned on going back. I told myself that for years, that the chapter was closed, that whatever had happened there was finished, that distance and time had done their work. I was wrong. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, tucked between advertisements and unpaid optimism. Plain envelope, no return address, no logo, just my name, typed cleanly on the front. Seeing it made my stomach tighten in a way that felt unearned, as if my body knew something my mind hadn't caught up to yet. Inside was a single sheet of paper, yellowed, thin, the kind of paper offices stopped using decades ago. The message was brief. The property is scheduled for demolition. Final inspection required. Your presence is requested. That was all. No signature, no explanation. Just my name again at the bottom, perfectly aligned, as if someone had tested the spacing more than once. I read it 3 times before realizing my hands were shaking. I didn't know why they would want me there. I hadn't owned the house. I hadn't lived there as an adult, but the request didn't feel optional. It felt like a reminder. The drive took just under 2 hours. The highway slowly thinned into a 2-lane road, then into something narrower and less certain. Streetlights became rare. Phone signal faded in and out. I passed the old grocery store first. Boarded windows, faded sign, then the school, still standing, still empty. The town had shrunk, but it hadn't disappeared. It felt paused, waiting for a reason to matter again. The road leading to the house wasn't paved anymore. Gravel gave way to dirt. The trees leaned closer together, forming a loose canopy overhead. I slowed the car without realizing I was doing it. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. I knew this road, not consciously, but my body did. It remembered when to brake, when to drift slightly left to avoid the deepest ruts. When the house came into view, I stopped breathing. It stood exactly where it always had, at the edge of the clearing, half swallowed by trees, smaller than I remembered, darker. The windows reflected the sky without revealing anything inside. I parked farther away than I needed to, sat there longer than necessary, told myself I was just gathering my thoughts. That was a lie. What I was really doing was hoping the feeling would pass. It didn't. The porch steps creaked the same way they always had. The 3rd step dipped slightly under my weight. The railing leaned inward subtly like it was listening. I stood there, key in hand, trying to remember when it had ended up in my pocket. I didn't remember bringing it. I didn't remember finding it. But there it was, warm. That should have unsettled me more than it did. Instead, it felt inevitable. The lock turned easily. Too easily. The door opened inward, just a few inches, as if it had been expecting me. The smell hit me first. Dust. Old wood. Something metallic, faint and distant. Underneath it all was something harder to define, not decay, presence. The air felt thick, not heavy, occupied. I stepped inside. The door closed behind me, not with a bang, not with a creak. It simply closed completely. The hallway stretched ahead, narrow and dim. The wallpaper had peeled in long vertical strips, exposing the wood beneath like veins. Every doorway stood open, waiting. The house felt quieter than it should have. Not silent, muted, as if sound was being absorbed before it could fully form. I took a step forward. The floorboard creaked. I froze. The sound felt louder than it should have been, like the house had been waiting for proof that I was real. I moved again, slower this time. The living room was on the left. The furniture was gone, but the room still remembered where it had been. There were pale outlines on the floor where a couch once sat. A darker patch near the wall where a table had stood. The fireplace was cold but clean. Someone had swept it at some point. That bothered me more than it should have. On the far wall there was a rectangle lighter than the rest. A space where something had hung for years. I stood beneath it. My chest tightened. I couldn't remember what the painting had been, but I remembered standing there before, looking up, feeling watched. I stepped back. The feeling lingered. The kitchen was smaller than I remembered. The cabinets hung crooked on their hinges. The counter was bare. Above the doorway the clock was still there, same shape, same dull brass frame. Its hands were frozen. 3:17. I stared at it longer than necessary, then checked my phone. 3:16. The second hand ticked forward. 3:17. I told myself it was coincidence. I told myself that clocks stop all the time, but something about the stillness of it felt deliberate, like a held breath. I turned away. That's when I heard it. A soft sound from behind me. Not a footstep, not quite. More like someone shifting their weight. I turned. The kitchen was empty. I listened. Nothing. I laughed quietly at myself. The sound died before it reached the walls. I walked back into the hallway. That's when I noticed the floor. The dust wasn't evenly spread. Near the base of the stairs there were two clean patches, oval-shaped, close together. Knee marks. I stared at them, my mouth dry. No footprints leading away. Just the impression of someone kneeling, facing the stairs, waiting. I didn't want to go upstairs. That was the first clear thought I'd had since arriving. I stood at the bottom of the stairs for a long time. The banister was smooth beneath my hand, worn, used. I remembered sliding my fingers along it as a child, counting the posts, avoiding the loose one near the top. I took the first step. It creaked. The second did too. The third didn't. That made my skin prickle. Halfway up, I felt it, that sense of being observed, not watched, recognized, like stepping into a room where a conversation has just stopped. I reached the landing. The upstairs hallway was darker than the one below. The windows were smaller, the light thinner, 3 doors, all open. The bathroom was first. The mirror above the sink was cracked in the upper corner. I don't remember it being cracked, but I remembered standing there, counting breaths, trying to stay quiet. I stepped closer. My reflection looked wrong, not distorted, delayed. I raised my hand. A fraction of a second passed before my reflection followed. I lowered it. The delay repeated. My heart started to race. I stepped back. The reflection matched me again, perfectly, as if nothing had happened. The sound came then from behind me, soft, high, a quiet inhale that didn't belong to me. I turned slowly. The hallway was empty, but the sound came again, from the far bedroom, a small sound, almost like a whimper. My legs moved before I decided to. Each step felt heavier than the last. The bedroom doorframe loomed ahead. The room beyond was darker. The air felt colder. I crossed the threshold. The sound stopped. The walls were bare, except for the scratches. At first they looked random. Shallow marks in the wood. But as my eyes adjusted, a pattern emerged. Groups of 5. Tallies. Dozens of them. Hundreds. I reached out, tracing one set with my finger. The wood felt smooth, not old, recently touched. I pulled my hand back. My throat tightened. I understood something then. The house wasn't empty. It was full, not of people, of moments, of things that had happened here and never left, and somewhere among them was me. I stood in that bedroom longer than I realized. The tally marks seemed to shift the longer I looked at them, not physically, but emotionally. At first, they were just scratches. Then they became time. Each group of 5 felt like a held breath, a moment stretched too long, a silence that should have been broken but wasn't. I didn't remember making them. That terrified me more than if I had, because it meant they belonged to a version of myself I'd lost access to. I stepped back into the hallway. The house felt closer now, not tighter, more attentive, as if it had noticed my attention and returned it. The air carried a faint sound, not a voice, more like movement inside the walls, a settling. I told myself houses do that, wood expands, contracts, adjusts. But this felt purposeful. I went into the second bedroom. This one had been mine. I recognized it immediately, the window placement, the angle of the light, the faint outline on the floor where my bed had once been. I stood in the exact spot where I used to lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling. I could almost feel the mattress beneath me. The slight dip near the middle. The wall opposite the bed had faint discoloration, not stains, smudges, as if someone had pressed their hands there over and over again, at child height. I reached out, placing my palm over one. It fit perfectly. A sound escaped me before I could stop it. A small, broken laugh. I pulled my hand away. That was when I heard my name, not spoken loudly, not whispered. Thought, the way you say your own name in your head when you're trying to remember something important. I didn't answer. I didn't turn. I closed my eyes. The sound came again. Closer. I felt it behind me. Not a presence, a familiarity. I opened my eyes and spun around. The room was empty. But the feeling remained, like someone had just stepped out of my personal space. I left the bedroom quickly. The stairs creaked under my feet as I descended. The house felt different now. Not hostile. Engaged. Like it had accepted that I was staying longer than planned. The living room light had changed. Clouds had moved outside, dimming the windows. The room felt heavier. I sat down on the floor, my back against the wall beneath the empty frame. I don't know why I chose that spot. I just knew it mattered. I tried to remember what had hung there. I closed my eyes. At first, nothing came. Then something stirred, not an image, a sensation. Standing still, holding my breath, listening. I remembered the sound of voices from another room, low, unclear, the sound of tension, the way the air felt thick with things unsaid. I opened my eyes. The room seemed smaller, the walls closer. I realized then that the house wasn't showing me memories in order. It was showing me what I avoided, the moments I had buried the deepest, the ones that shaped everything that came after. The kitchen clock ticked once, loud. I flinched. I stared toward the doorway. The clock hadn't moved. Still 3:17. But I could feel time pressing forward anyway. I stood and walked into the kitchen. The air there felt colder, sharper. I leaned against the counter, suddenly exhausted. That was when I noticed the chair. One chair sat pulled out slightly from the table. It hadn't been there before. I was sure of it. I stared at it for a long time. Slowly, carefully, I pulled it back and sat down. The wood creaked beneath my weight. The sound echoed. The house listened. I don't know how long I sat there, minutes, maybe more. My thoughts began to drift. That was when the voices started, not one, several, low murmuring. They didn't come from a single direction. They came from everywhere, from the walls, the ceiling, the floor beneath my feet. They weren't saying words at first. They were tones, emotions, fear, confusion, loneliness. Then words began to surface. Fragments. He's still here. Be quiet. Don't move. My chest tightened. I recognized those phrases. They weren't spoken to me. They were spoken around me, over me. I pressed my hands against my ears. It didn't help. The sound wasn't traveling through the air. It was coming from inside. The voices began to align, merge, until one stood out, clear, calm, older. It spoke from behind me. You stayed longer than most. I turned slowly. The kitchen was empty. My heart pounded. What do you want? I asked. The question surprised me. It felt rehearsed, as if I had asked it before. We don't want, the voice replied. We keep. The word echoed. I stood, backing away from the table. What do you keep? I asked. There was a pause, not silence, consideration. Everything that couldn't leave, the voice said. The room felt smaller again. I swallowed. And me? I asked. Another pause. You already left, the voice said. That's why you're incomplete. The words hit harder than I expected. I felt lightheaded. Incomplete. The voice wasn't accusing. It was stating a fact. I thought of the tally marks, the knee prints, the smudged walls. I thought of the way I had spent my adult life feeling like something essential was missing. Like I was always waiting for a moment that never came. What do you want me to do? I asked again. The voice softened. Remember properly? The lights flickered. Once, twice, then steadied. The living room door creaked. I turned toward it. The hallway beyond was darker than before, deeper, inviting. I took a step, then another. The sound of my footsteps felt distant, unimportant. I passed the stairs without looking at them. The hallway at the back of the house led to a door I hadn't opened yet, the one room I had avoided. My hand hovered over the knob. I didn't want to go inside. That told me everything. I turned the handle. The door opened. The room was empty, completely. No marks, no furniture, no windows, just bare walls and a bare floor. The air felt still, waiting. This is where you stayed quiet, the voice said. This is where you learned how. I stepped inside. The door closed behind me, not loudly, not suddenly, just completely. The room felt wrong, too clean, too intact. I felt small, younger. I sat down against the wall without realizing I was doing it. My knees pulled toward my chest. My breathing slowed. The memories came then, not images, sensations, the sound of raised voices through walls, the instinct to stay invisible, the belief that silence was safety. I felt tears on my face. I didn't remember crying. The voice spoke one last time. You left this part of you here, it said. We kept it safe. The room seemed to breathe, slow, steady. And I realized the truth. The house wasn't trapping me. It was holding on to what I had abandoned. I don't know how long I stayed in that room. Time didn't move the way it should have. There was no window, no light shift, no sound from outside, only my breathing, slow, unsteady at first, then calmer. The room didn't feel threatening, that disturbed me. It felt familiar, like a place I had learned to disappear into. I realized then that this wasn't a room meant for living, it was a room meant for enduring. The walls were too plain, too quiet, nothing to hold on to except yourself, and even that felt optional. I stood slowly. The air pressed gently against my skin like resistance. The door opened when I touched it. No hesitation, no sound. The hallway beyond looked unchanged. But I felt heavier, not physically, internally, like something had been placed back where it belonged. The house felt calmer too, not silent, satisfied. I moved through it differently now, not cautiously, respectfully. The voices didn't return. Instead, there was a sense of presence beside me, not guiding, accompanying. I returned to the living room and sat again beneath the empty frame. The spot felt warmer than before. I leaned my head back against the wall and closed my eyes. This time, the memory came clearly. The painting had been a landscape, a field under a grey sky, a single tree near the center. I remembered staring at it when the house felt loud, using it as proof that other places existed. I opened my eyes. The wall was still bare, but the image lingered. I smiled faintly. The kitchen clock ticked again, once. I stood quickly and looked toward the doorway. The hands had moved. 3:18. I didn't feel relief. I felt something closer to sadness. The house had been holding time still for me. I walked to the front door. The handle felt different in my hand. Cool. Neutral. I hesitated. Not because I was afraid to leave, because I understood what leaving meant. I had come back to retrieve something, and now I carried it. The house didn't need me anymore. That thought felt heavier than I expected. I opened the door. The outside light felt sharp, too bright. I stepped onto the porch and turned back. The house looked the same, still quiet, but no longer watching. I closed the door gently. The lock clicked. Final. I walked down the steps. The gravel crunched beneath my feet. The sound felt loud, alive. As I reached my car, I paused. Something pulled at my attention. Not a voice, a feeling. I turned back. For a moment I thought I saw movement in an upstairs window. Not a figure. A shift, like someone stepping away. I didn't wave. I didn't speak. I got in the car and drove away. They demolished the house 3 weeks later. I didn't go back. I didn't need to. The report said it came down easily. Too easily. The workers mentioned how quiet the job was. No strange sounds. No resistance, just wood and dust. One of them said it felt like the building wanted to be gone. They laughed about it. I didn't. The empty lot looks smaller now, unimportant. People pass it without slowing. Grass has started to grow, but sometimes when I drive past, I feel it. Not watching, remembering. Not me. It doesn't need to anymore. But itself. I sleep differently now, deeper, quieter. The listening habit is gone. I don't wait for footsteps. I don't brace for raised voices. I don't disappear when rooms feel tense, but occasionally, when the world grows too loud, I think of that quiet room, and I understand what it taught me. Silence can be survival, but it shouldn't be a home. Some places keep what we can't. Some places wait, and some houses remember us until we're ready to remember ourselves. Story 2. The sea has a way of making history feel fragile. Logs fade, paper curls, tapes corrode in salt air. Even digital files seem uncertain when the shore has erased entire ships without leaving a splinter. I was sent to Blackwater Point because no one else wanted it. My name is Thomas Hale. I'm an archivist for the Coastal Service. I catalogue decommissioned equipment, preserve records from lighthouses and stations no longer in use. Most of my work happens inland, where history behaves itself. The lighthouse at Blackwater Point did not behave. It had been dark for 27 years. Automated systems made it redundant. Budget cuts made it inconvenient to demolish. Storm damage made it fragile, so it sat. Concrete spine against jagged rocks, lantern room sealed, rust climbing the radio mast, its name disappearing from modern charts. I arrived at the lighthouse on a grey morning. Waves beat against the cliffs like a heartbeat that had gone on too long. The wind carried the smell of salt and decay. The door groaned as I pushed it open, and inside, dust floated in shafts of light like tiny ghosts. The control room was intact. Ancient dials, switches, and a large radio console. Everything coated in salt and rust. There was a faint hum in the background, a vibration that seemed alive. I cleaned the equipment, replaced corroded wiring, tested the generator, and finally powered up the radio. Static hissed through the speakers. I adjusted the knobs until a faint crackle of life emerged. I spoke into the microphone. "This is Blackwater Point. Is anyone receiving?" Nothing for hours, nothing. Then a response. Faint, hesitant. Broken, a voice. "Mayday, mayday. Vessel lost. Coordinates uncertain." I froze. The log said the ship had vanished 50 years ago. Its name had been stricken from all records. Yet here it was calling. I repeated the call, asking for more information. Static answered. Then a series of faint replies. The radio seemed to know the frequency I preferred. The voice grew clearer, telling me things no living witness could know. Details about the ship's last hours, cargo manifests, crew names. I spent the night listening. By morning, exhaustion had replaced disbelief. The calls had stopped, yet a strange sense lingered. The radio was not entirely empty. I could feel it waiting. Over the next few days, the voices returned, ships lost in storms decades ago, appearing on the frequency as if the sea itself remembered them. They spoke in echoes, fragments, names, coordinates, sometimes questions, sometimes warnings, always brief, always fading into static. Then the message changed. A voice I did not recognize, calm and insistent, whispered my name. "Thomas!" I laughed, thinking it a trick of exhaustion. But it repeated, "Thomas Hale." I realized then that the lighthouse was not just broadcasting the past. It was aware of me, watching, waiting. I had restored more than a radio. I had opened a channel the sea never forgot existed. The next night, I returned to the radio. The wind had risen. Waves crashed against the cliffs with a force that shook the floorboards. I felt the lighthouse breathing along with the storm, alive in a way I hadn't expected. I powered up the console. Static filled the room. I adjusted the dials and spoke. "Blackwater Point calling. Any vessels, please respond." At first, only silence. Then a faint crackle, followed by a voice. "Thomas," it said. I froze. I hadn't spoken my name aloud. I hadn't left it anywhere in the lighthouse. The voice was low, calm, yet insistent, like it knew me. "Who is this?" I asked, though I had a sinking suspicion I already knew. A pause. "Then you restored the channel. I've been waiting." The signal was weak, distorted by years of salt and wind, but the message was unmistakable. Someone, or something, had been expecting me. I spent the night listening. Ships lost decades ago replied to my transmissions. Some told fragmented stories of storms, confusion, and fear. Others asked for directions, as though expecting me to guide them through waters that no longer existed. I realized something then. This was not just a radio. It was a bridge, a connection to the sea's memory. Days passed, and the messages became more personal. A voice would whisper my name before providing coordinates. Another described the lighthouse's position in terms only I would understand. The sea was speaking through the static, and I was the only one listening. One night, a new voice appeared, soft but urgent. "Thomas," it said, "do not leave the light off." I hesitated. "I'm here." "I won't leave." "Not enough," the voice continued. "The light is not for you. It is for them." I realized then that the ships were not just lost. They were waiting, trapped between the waves and time, tethered to the memory of this lighthouse. The radio had become a lighthouse of its own, guiding those who could not find their way. Storms came and went. I kept the radio running day and night, recording everything, cataloging the voices. Sometimes they argued. Sometimes they whispered secrets of the ocean I could barely comprehend. One even spoke of names I recognized from old Coast Guard logs, sailors who had disappeared without trace. And then the voice changed. It was no longer faint, distorted, or hesitant. It was direct, commanding. "Thomas Hale," it said, "you are not just listening. You are responsible." The sea never forgot who it took. I understood immediately. This was no longer about recording history. It was about keeping it alive, maintaining a balance between the living and the lost. I began sleeping less, eating less, consumed by the radio and its messages. Every creak of the lighthouse, every gust of wind against the cliffs, felt like the presence of the lost vessels. They were here, waiting, speaking through static and time. One night, a new signal arrived. Coordinates. Clear, exact. I recognized the format. They pointed to the location of a ship that had disappeared 50 years ago in a violent storm. I knew I had to respond. Not because I could save it, but because it expected me to. I adjusted the dials, spoke into the microphone, and waited. A voice answered. Familiar, yet impossibly distant. "Thomas," it said, "guide us home." I felt the lighthouse tremble beneath my feet. The sea outside roared like it had a voice of its own, and I knew then that this would never end. Not until I could bring every lost vessel, every forgotten voice, to rest. The lighthouse was alive, and it had chosen me as its keeper. The days passed without distinction. The sea and the sky blurred into one endless gray. The waves crashed relentlessly, and the lighthouse groaned under the pressure of wind and water. Every night, the radio came alive, voices drifting through static, urgent and patient, demanding to be heard. Sometimes the voices argued. One would call out a ship's name, another would insist the coordinates were wrong. Yet every argument ended in silence, as if the ocean itself had the final say. I began noticing other sounds, footsteps in the lantern room when I hadn't been there, scratches along the walls like claws trying to find purchase, a low hum running beneath the generator, almost like a pulse. The lighthouse was responding to the sea's memory, and I was its only observer. One night I heard a child's voice, clear, insistent, yet impossibly far away. "Thomas," it said, "you are needed." I knew immediately it was not a person. It was the echo of the sea itself, taking form through the radio. My hands shook as I adjusted the dials, attempting to communicate. "Where are you?" I asked. "Here," the voice said, "and there. The sea has kept us waiting. Guide us." The radio static shifted, forming patterns I could barely interpret. Coordinates appeared, names of ships, crew members, years. I realized the voices were trying to lead me, to show me what had been lost. I stayed up for 3 nights in a row, listening, recording, cataloging. The messages were becoming clearer, almost conversational, like the lost vessels were learning to speak through the machinery I had restored. I began to see patterns. Certain frequencies carried the voices of ships lost in storms. Others held messages from vessels that had simply vanished without trace. Then the calls stopped. Silence filled the lighthouse, but it was heavy, oppressive. The sea outside churned as if impatient. The lighthouse seemed to lean toward me, expecting. I realized then that the silence itself was part of the message. It was waiting for me to act. I powered up the radio again. Static. Nothing, then a whisper. My own name, Thomas Hale. I froze. I hadn't spoken aloud, hadn't left my name anywhere near the radio, and yet it was being spoken to me. Clear, certain, expectant. Guide us, it said. I knew then that this was no longer about listening. It was about responsibility. I had restored a channel, not just to the past, but to the souls the sea had claimed. They were tethered to this lighthouse, waiting for someone to keep their stories alive. Weeks passed. I slept less. I ate less. I barely moved from the lantern room. The radio never stopped. Ships long forgotten called to me nightly. Coordinates, crew names, details of storms I had read about only in faded logs, all conveyed with an urgency I could not ignore. Sometimes, a voice would speak directly to me about the lighthouse itself. You are the keeper, they said. The sea never forgets. And I understood that the lighthouse had chosen me. The isolation began to warp my sense of time. Days blended into nights. The waves seemed endless. The wind carried whispers I could not trace. And the radio, always the radio, called me forward. One night, the console flickered. Coordinates appeared I had never seen. A ship lost 70 years ago. The radio pulsed with energy I could feel through the floorboards. The voice came again, clearer than ever. Thomas. You must guide us. I knew I had no choice. I had opened a channel the sea never forgot, and now it demanded I act. The storm that night was unlike any I had ever witnessed. Waves rose like mountains, slamming against the cliffs with a violence that shook the lighthouse to its foundation. The wind howled through cracks in the walls, carrying voices I had never heard before. New ships, lost crews, cries for guidance. I remained at the radio, adjusting dials, scribbling coordinates, responding to every message as best I could. Each voice demanded attention. Each call carried a history I could feel in my bones. And then it spoke to me directly. Thomas Hale, the voice said. Calm, unyielding, certain. You cannot abandon us. You are the keeper. I understood the truth all at once. This lighthouse was not abandoned. It was alive in a way the world could not measure. It remembered the ships, the crews, the storms, the disappearances. It remembered the sea itself, and it had chosen me to maintain that memory. The radio pulsed in my hands. Static became coherent speech. I heard ship names I had only read in logs, crew members who had vanished without a trace. They were here, waiting, needing me. I realized then that the lighthouse had been speaking all along. Through dials, switches, and wires. Through the walls, the floor, the wind. It had been waiting for someone to listen and respond, and now it had me. The storm outside intensified. I felt the floor tremble beneath me, as if the sea itself were pressing against the lighthouse. The radio emitted a low hum, vibrating through my chest, through my skull. Every lost ship, every forgotten crew, spoke through it simultaneously. "Guide us," the voices demanded, overlapping, merging, a chorus that stretched beyond time. I responded. I gave coordinates, recited names, read aloud the histories of ships long gone. I spoke into the microphone as though the words themselves could carry the vessels home. Hours passed, or maybe days. Time lost all meaning. The wind screamed, the waves crashed, and the voices never ceased. At some point, I stopped feeling the storm outside. There was only the lighthouse, the radio, and the sea's memory pressing through the speakers. I understood then that I had become part of it, the keeper of a channel that had always existed, waiting for someone patient enough, someone persistent enough, to answer. The voices began to soften. Names and coordinates faded into static. The storm outside diminished to a low roar, and in the quiet a single voice spoke clearly. "Thomas," it said, "you are here. The sea remembers. You remembered." I turned off the radio. I stood in the lantern room and looked out at the water. The horizon stretched endlessly, grey and silent. The lighthouse had survived the storm, but I knew that it would never be quiet. The sea never forgot, and neither would it ever truly leave me. I understood my place. I was the keeper, the recorder, the witness. And if I left, the voices would wait for another. If I stayed, I preserved the memory, held the channel open. The lighthouse's walls seemed to hum softly, almost like a sigh, as the sea calmed. I sat in the lantern room and listened, knowing the calls would come again someday, to remind me that nothing lost in the ocean is ever truly gone. The sea never forgot who it took, and neither did I. Story 3. I worked emergency dispatch for 23 years. I answered phones that never stopped ringing. Even on holidays, even during storms, even when the city felt like it was holding its breath. I learned very early that people don't sound the way you expect when something is wrong. They don't always scream. Sometimes they whisper. Sometimes they breathe too slowly. Sometimes they sound relieved, like the decision has already been made and they're just calling to confirm it. That was the part of the job no one warned you about. You aren't there to save people. You're there to witness the moment they realize what's happening to them. I retired quietly. No ceremony, no farewell shift. I turned in my badge, cleared my locker, and walked out of the building with the same lunch I brought in that morning. I told myself I was done listening. For 3 years that was true. Then my phone rang. It was an old landline, still plugged into the wall out of habit more than need. I kept it because I liked the weight of it, the certainty. It didn't buzz or light up or demand attention. It only rang when someone, somewhere physically decided to call. The number was blocked. That wasn't unusual. Emergency dispatchers get used to blocked numbers. People panic, systems glitch, phones fail at the worst possible moment. Still, when I picked it up, I answered the way I always had. Emergency services. "What's your location?" There was breathing on the other end. Slow, careful, controlled, not panic. Then a voice, male, middle-aged, calm in the way people get when they're trying not to sound afraid. He said my name, not loudly, not urgently, like he was checking to see if I was still there. I told myself it was coincidence. There are a lot of Daniels in the world, a lot of Rose. Dispatchers get recognized sometimes. Voices get remembered. I asked for his location again. He ignored the question. He said, "This is not a real emergency yet. I just need you to listen." That sentence alone should have told me something was wrong. Real emergencies don't introduce themselves. I told him I couldn't help unless he told me where he was. He said, "You already helped once." I felt something tighten in my chest then. A reflex I hadn't felt in years. The instinct to start scanning memory, searching for a voice match, a familiar cadence, anything I could pin down. I asked him how he got this number. He said, "You gave it to me." Then the line went dead. No click, no dial tone, just silence. I stared at the phone for a long time after that. Long enough to feel foolish for letting my heart rate climb. Long enough to convince myself it had been a prank or a dream, or a fragment of my old job bleeding into retirement. I unplugged the phone. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. The next call came the following night. Same time, same block number. This time when I picked up, I didn't say anything. The breathing was there again. Then the same voice. "Daniel," he said, "you always wait now." I asked him who he was. He said, "You don't remember the calls that don't end badly. You only remember the ones that do." That was true. Every dispatcher knows it. The routine calls fade. The false alarms disappear. The wrong numbers blur together, but the others stay. The ones where you hear something break. The ones where the caller stops responding. The ones where you realize halfway through that you're listening to someone's last conversation. I asked him to tell me what was wrong. He said, "Nothing yet." That's why I'm calling early. I told him he was on a private line and that if he continued, I'd report the call. He laughed quietly. "You never reported these before." That's when I noticed something else. There was no background noise, no traffic, no hum of electricity, no wind, no television in another room, just his breathing and mine. I hung up. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I called my old supervisor. I asked her if there had been any reports of prank calls using retired dispatcher information. She said no. She sounded tired. She always sounded tired. Before she hung up, she asked me something strange. She asked if I'd been listening to old tapes again. I told her I didn't have any tapes. She didn't answer right away. Then she said, "Just checking." That afternoon, I went into my storage closet. I hadn't opened it since I moved in. Boxes from my old apartment stacked on top of each other, labeled in my handwriting from another life. One box just said work. Inside were notebooks, manuals, old schedules. And at the bottom, wrapped in a towel I didn't remember using, a cassette recorder. Not department issued, personal. I stared at it for a long time before touching it. I didn't remember owning it. I didn't remember making recordings. But my name was scratched into the back with a key. Daniel Rowe. There was a cassette inside, no label. That night, the phone rang again. Before I could reach it, my answering machine clicked on. I hadn't used it in years. I didn't even know if it still worked. The voice came through the speaker. "Daniel," he said, "you're getting close now." I picked up the receiver. I asked him what he wanted. He said, "I want you to remember why you stopped listening." I told him I didn't know what he meant. He said, "You told me once that hearing is not the same as helping." That sentence landed heavier than anything else he'd said, because it was something I used to tell new dispatchers, something I believed. I asked him when we spoke before. He said, "On a night you don't log anymore." I asked him what was going to happen. There was a pause then. "The first real one," he said. "That depends on whether you answer the last call." The line went dead. I sat there for a long time holding the phone. Then I took the cassette recorder out of the closet. I didn't play the tape. Not yet. I told myself I was in control. I told myself the calls would stop. They didn't. Over the next week, the phone rang every night. Different voices, different ages, different emergencies that hadn't happened yet. A woman who said her house smelled like smoke, but she couldn't see fire. A teenager who said his friend hadn't moved in a while, but he was still warm. An old man who said he could hear someone walking through his hallway, counting steps. Every call ended the same way, before anything happened, before there was proof, before I could help, and every caller knew my name. On the 7th night, the cassette recorder turned on by itself. I hadn't plugged it in. The tape began to play, and I heard my own voice. "You're safe for now," I was saying. "Just stay with me." The date stamped faintly on the cassette window was from a year I still worked dispatch, a year I didn't remember losing, and as I listened I realized something else. The call on the tape hadn't ended. It was still going, and somewhere beneath my own recorded voice I could hear another line opening, another call waiting, one I hadn't answered yet. I didn't stop the tape. I should have. Anyone with sense would have. But there's a particular weakness that comes from spending your life answering phones. You get conditioned to believe that if you just listen long enough, the situation will clarify itself. The tape played my voice, steady and practiced, calm in the way I hadn't felt in years. I was speaking to someone who couldn't stop apologizing. They kept saying they were sorry for calling so late, sorry for bothering me, sorry for taking up space. I remembered those callers, the ones who treated emergencies like inconveniences they weren't entitled to have. On the tape, I told them they were doing the right thing. I told them help was on the way. That part made my stomach turn, because I knew how rarely that was true. The other voice on the tape was faint, distorted, like it was being recorded through another line, layered beneath the first. I couldn't make out the words at first. I leaned closer. That was when the phone rang, not the landline. My cell phone. A number came up that didn't make sense. Too many digits. Not formatted for any country code I recognized. I let it ring. The tape kept playing. My recorded voice asked for a location. The other voice hesitated. Then my cell phone stopped ringing, and the voice on the tape answered. The address they gave was mine. I shut the recorder off. The silence afterward felt thick, like the air before a storm. I stood there, one hand still on the cassette player, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. I slept with the lights on that night. The next morning I drove to the old dispatch center. I hadn't been back since I retired. The building looked smaller than I remembered, more ordinary. No ghosts in the windows, no sense of importance. Inside, everything smelled the same. Coffee, carpet cleaner, electronics that never fully cooled. The woman at the front desk didn't recognize me at first. Then she did, and her smile tightened just slightly. She asked how retirement was treating me. I told her I had a question. She took me to an empty break room and closed the door. I asked her about off-book recordings, personal tapes, unlogged calls. Her face changed. She asked me where I'd heard that term. I told her I found something at home. She said that wasn't good. She told me slowly that there had been rumors years ago. Dispatchers who recorded calls without logging them, not for training, not for evidence, for listening. She said some people believed certain calls didn't fit into the system properly, that they came in early or late or not at all, calls that slipped through. She laughed when she said it, but it sounded forced. I asked her if anyone had ever admitted to doing it. She hesitated. Then she said my name. She said there had been an internal note once, no formal investigation, just a concern. I had been flagged for staying late too often, for listening to dead air, for replaying calls that had already ended. I told her that wasn't possible. She shrugged. She said burnout makes people strange. I asked her if anyone else had complained recently. She said no, but as I stood to leave, she added something else. She said the lines had been acting up again. Calls with no source. Calls that disconnected before addresses could be logged. I asked when that started. She said about 3 weeks ago. The same week my phone started ringing. That night the calls came earlier. Before sunset, the first was a child who said his mother was sleeping and wouldn't wake up. He spoke in a whisper like he didn't want to disturb her. He asked me how long sleep usually lasted. I told him I didn't know. He thanked me for being honest. The second was a woman who said she could hear water running somewhere in her apartment, but every faucet was off. She said it sounded closer every time she checked. I asked her to leave the apartment. She said she wasn't allowed to. She said the water had rules. The third call was the one that broke me. It was my voice. Older than the tape, but unmistakably mine, he said. "This is the part where you hang up." I didn't. He told me I wouldn't remember this conversation clearly later. That memory wasn't built to hold overlapping timelines. He said that wasn't my fault. I asked him if he was me. He said not exactly, but close enough that it doesn't matter. I asked him why this was happening. He said, "Because you answered a call that never ended." He told me about the first time. A call that came in between logged seconds, not early enough to be flagged, not late enough to be traced. A voice that didn't ask for help, just for someone to stay. I asked him what happened to that caller. He said, "You stayed too long." I remembered then. Not clearly, just fragments, a night shift that blurred into morning, a voice that sounded calmer the longer I listened, the sense that something terrible would happen if I hung up. I asked him if the caller survived. He said survival was the wrong word. He said some people don't disappear. They overlap. They exist in the space between calls. I asked him what the last emergency call was. There was a long silence. Then he said, "You already know. You just haven't answered it yet." The line went dead. I played the cassette again that night. This time, I listened to the entire recording. It was longer than it should have been. Hours of audio compressed onto a single tape, calls without timestamps, voices bleeding into each other. Me answering questions I couldn't hear. Near the end, my voice changed. Less professional, more tired. I was begging someone to stay with me. I was telling them they didn't have to go yet. The last voice on the tape wasn't a caller. It was silence shaped like listening, and beneath it, faint but unmistakable, was the sound of a phone ringing, not in the room, not on the tape, inside my head. That was when I realized something I should have understood from the beginning. Emergency lines don't just connect people to help. They connect people to witnesses. And sometimes the witness doesn't get to hang up. After that night, I stopped answering the phone. That didn't stop the calls. The landline rang anyway. The cell phone lit up with numbers that refused to stay on the screen. Sometimes the ringing came from rooms I wasn't in. Once, I heard it from inside the bathroom mirror. I unplugged everything. I pulled cords from walls. I powered down devices. I even shut off the breaker, standing in the dark long enough to convince myself that silence still existed. The ringing continued. Not loud, not insistent, patient. It rang the way something rings when it knows you'll answer eventually. I started writing things down. Dates, times, snippets of what I could remember before the details slipped away because memory had begun to behave strangely. Whole conversations faded within minutes, while unimportant fragments stayed sharp. The sound of breathing, the cadence of apologies. The way people said thank you right before they stopped responding. I noticed a pattern then. The calls weren't random. They followed the same arc every time. First, uncertainty, then awareness, then acceptance. No panic, no screaming, just realization, and always they ended before anything irreversible happened, as if the moment itself was being preserved. That was when I understood something else. These weren't people calling for help. They were people calling to be heard. I returned to the cassette recorder. It felt heavier every time I picked it up, like it was accumulating weight from the voices inside it. I bought new tapes, labeled them by date, tried to impose order. The recordings didn't care. Sometimes the tape played things I hadn't recorded. Sometimes it skipped ahead to voices I hadn't heard yet. Once, I found my own handwriting on a label I didn't remember making. Last call. Do not answer. I answered anyway, because the call that came through that night wasn't like the others. It didn't come through the phone. It came through the tape. My voice again. Closer now. More urgent. He said, "You're running out of room." I asked him what that meant. He said, "You've been listening for too long without passing it on." I asked who I was supposed to pass it to. He said, "Someone who still thinks answering the phone is a choice." That was when I realized why the calls felt familiar. Not because I remembered them, because I had trained for them. I had taught new dispatchers how to slow callers down, how to anchor them to the present moment, how to keep them talking until help arrived. But what if help never arrived? What if the talking was the point? The next day I went through old records, personal ones, things I'd kept from my career without knowing why. There was one case file that didn't belong with the others. No official number, no outcome, just a name. Mine. The notes were sparse. Caller maintained contact longer than usual. Subject demonstrated resistance to disengagement. Outcome unresolved. I didn't remember writing it. But I remembered the feeling, the pull, the sense that if I stayed on the line just a little longer, something terrible could be delayed. The calls intensified after that. They came in clusters, sometimes 3 at once, overlapping. Voices bleeding into each other, all asking for reassurance I couldn't give. One caller asked me if time was supposed to move like this. Another asked if it hurt to become background noise. One simply stayed silent, breathing softly, like they were listening to me instead. I started answering again, not because I wanted to, because something inside me needed to. Every call I answered brought relief, not for them, for me. The ringing quieted, the pressure eased. The sense of something pressing in from the edges of my awareness receded until the next call, until the next voice, until the next moment suspended just before everything changed. I stopped leaving the house. I slept in shifts. I began to recognize certain voices even when they tried to disguise themselves, certain patterns of speech, certain rhythms of fear. They weren't all human. I don't know how else to say that. Some voices didn't understand questions. Some repeated phrases they'd learned from previous callers. Some sounded like they were calling from rooms that were too large or too small to exist. One voice asked me what I remembered about dying. I told them I didn't know. They said, "Neither do we. That's why we keep calling." The tape recorder filled up faster than I could change it. Tapes rewound themselves. Sometimes I heard things backwards. Sometimes I heard myself answering calls I hadn't received yet. Near the end of one tape, my voice whispered something I didn't remember saying. "He's not answering anymore." That terrified me more than anything else, because I was answering constantly. The next call came through at dawn. The voice on the line was calm, familiar. It was the man from the first night. He said, "It's almost time." I asked him for what. He said, "For you to understand what an emergency really is." I asked him what happened to the people who called before the event. He said, "They stayed." I asked him where. He said, "In the moment you never stop listening to." I asked him what would happen if I didn't answer the last call. There was a pause. Then he said, "Someone else will." And the line went silent. The phone didn't ring again that day, or the next. The quiet was unbearable, because I could feel the calls stacking up, waiting. And deep down, beneath the exhaustion and the fear, there was something worse. Relief. Because I knew what was coming. I had always known, I just hadn't admitted it yet. The last emergency call isn't the one where everything goes wrong. It's the one where nothing happens. The one where someone stays on the line forever. Story 4. I did not expect the box to be heavy, not in the way it was. Cardboard usually is not. It has a certain honesty to it. You can feel when it is empty. You can feel when it is full. This one resisted me, as if the weight inside it was not settled, as if it adjusted itself when I tried to lift it. The label on the lid was typed, all capital letters, no logo, no address, no return information, audio material, intake only, that was all. No date, no reference number, no sender. The loading bay at the archive is always cold, concrete walls, metal shelving, fluorescent lights that hum softly no matter the hour. I had been working there long enough to know the temperature by feel alone. That morning the air was the same as always. Still, when I set my hands on the box, it felt warm. Not hot, just not cold. I told myself it was imagination, residual heat from transport. A trick of contrast against my skin. I adjusted my grip and lifted it onto the intake table. It landed without sound, no thud, no scrape, no hollow echo of cardboard on steel. It settled gently, as though something inside had shifted to soften the impact. I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, listening for a noise that never came. My name is Daniel Crow. That is the name on my contract, at least. It is the name attached to my credentials, my invoices, and the small plaque on the workstation I have used for the past 3 years. I am a freelance audio archivist. I clean recordings. I catalog them. I restore what time is damaged and label what time is forgotten. Libraries, universities, museums, private institutions, sometimes estates, sometimes collectors who believe they have captured something impossible. I do not judge the material. I preserve it. The request for this job arrived without ceremony, no phone call, no interview, just a digital contract sent through an intermediary service I had worked with before. The terms were simple: intake, review, cataloging, preliminary transcription. Payment was generous, unusually so. The client name listed was North Meridian Holdings. It meant nothing to me then. Inside the box were cassette tapes, standard size, clear plastic cases, well preserved. They were stacked neatly, but not tightly, as though whoever packed them had left space on purpose. Each spine bore the same handwritten words, written thinly in black marker. Room interview, again and again. No numbering, no dates, no initials. Just those reminder-like words repeated across every case. I counted 36 tapes before realizing there was another layer beneath them. I never finished counting the rest. Standard intake procedure exists for a reason. You log the material. You photograph it. You assign reference codes. You establish provenance. You do not listen before you do those things. It protects the archive. It protects the archivist. I broke the rule almost immediately. Not because of curiosity, because one of the tapes was already playing. At first I thought the sound came from the building itself. The archive is full of quiet machines. Ventilation systems, climate controls, old electrical systems humming softly behind the walls. This was different. There was rhythm to it. A soft, steady movement like breath measured against time. I became aware of a voice only after I realized I was already listening. You can stop the recording whenever you are ready. The voice was close, too close, male, calm, professional. It did not echo. It did not distort. It sounded as if the speaker was standing beside the table. The cassette player on my workstation was off. I was certain of that. The power light was dark. There was no tape loaded. I followed the sound back to the box. One cassette lay loose among the others. Its case was open. The tape window faced upward. The reels were turning, slowly, without a machine. I did not touch it right away. I watched the reels spin, listening to the soft, dry sound of magnetic tape moving through nothing at all. My mind tried to supply explanations. Hidden motor, residual tension, air movement. None of them held. When I finally picked up the cassette, the reels stopped. The voice stopped with them. The silence that followed felt intentional, as if it had been waiting. I told myself I would document the anomaly later. I loaded the cassette into the player. The mechanism accepted it without resistance. The power light came on. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a soft tone sounded, the kind used to mark the start of a recording. A woman spoke. Interview subject is seated. Her voice was measured. Trained, familiar in a way that suggested repetition. Please state your name for the record. There was a pause. Then a man answered. My name is... He stopped. I am not sure which one you want. There was no fear in his voice, no distress, just a mild uncertainty, like someone searching through old drawers for something they had not needed in a long time. The woman responded without surprise. The one you were given, she said. The one that brought you here? Silence stretched. I became aware of my own breathing. The man spoke again. I was told not to keep it, he said. They said it would make things uneven. The woman acknowledged this with a soft sound of understanding. That is all right. We will work with what you remember. I glanced at the tape counter. It read 0. It did not move. The interview continued. Questions about childhood. Questions about sleep. Questions about rooms with no windows. The man answered carefully, not hesitantly, carefully, as if listening to something else before responding. At one point, the woman asked him if he knew why he was there. He laughed, quietly. Because the room needs witnesses, he said. I stopped the tape. The room felt different afterward. Not colder, not darker, just fuller, as if something unseen had leaned closer, satisfied. I logged the tape as RMINT01. I photographed it. I noted its condition. I wrote that the audio quality was excellent. I wrote that there was no audible degradation. I wrote that the source was unknown. I did not write about the tape playing on its own. That night I dreamed of a door I could not remember opening. On the other side was my studio, the same table, the same shelves, the same recorder, except the table was empty, and the recorder was already running. When I woke, there was a cassette on my desk. No case, no label, just 3 words written in black marker. The ink was still wet. You were listening. I did not touch the cassette for several minutes. It rested at the center of my desk where I had not placed it. The plastic was clear, unmarked, identical to the others except for the writing. The words "you were listening" sat slightly off-center, as if written in a hurry or without concern for alignment. The ink smell lingered faintly. Fresh. That was the part that stayed with me. Not fear, not confusion, just the certainty that whatever had written those words had done so recently. I checked the studio door, locked. The windows were sealed. They always were. The archive does not allow natural light into rooms where media is handled. Too much risk. Too much variability. Nothing was out of place, except the tape. I told myself there was a simple explanation. Fatigue, a lapse in memory. I had worked late the night before. I had taken on too many contracts at once. The mind fills gaps when it is tired. I placed the cassette into an empty case and labeled it RMINT. 02, that should have been the end of it. I spent the morning performing intake properly, logging each cassette from the original box, photographing them under consistent light, assigning reference numbers in sequence. RMINT01 through RMINT038 through should not have been room for 38. The box had not changed size. I did not count again. By midday, the archive was quiet in the way it only ever is around noon. Too late for early staff, too early for afternoon researchers. The building felt suspended, holding its breath between shifts. I decided to resume listening professionally. I selected RMINT03 at random. The tape counter reset to 0. It did not move. The woman's voice returned, unchanged. Interview subject is seated. Please confirm you can hear me. The man responded immediately this time. Yes. No hesitation. No confusion. The woman continued. Do you know where you are? There was a pause. I know where I am not, the man said. She acknowledged this. That is a common response. Her tone suggested she had heard it many times before. The questions followed a pattern I recognized. Orientation, sensory awareness, memory recall, the kind of structure used in cognitive assessments and intake evaluations, but there were deviations. Questions about thresholds, questions about reflections, questions about sounds that continue after their source has stopped. At one point, the man stopped answering altogether. The silence stretched long enough that I leaned forward, instinctively checking the levels. Then he spoke. Are you recording this part? He asked. The woman did not answer immediately. Yes, she said. That is unfortunate. I felt a pressure behind my eyes then. A mild headache, blooming quickly and fading just as fast. The tape ended without a closing tone. The recorder clicked off on its own. I sat back and waited for something else to happen. Nothing did. I told myself that unease was part of the job. Old recordings have a way of pulling you inward if you let them. Human voices carry presence, even when the speaker is long gone. Still, I found myself glancing toward the door more often than necessary. The next tape, RM-0 began mid-sentence. "We tried removing the mirrors," the man was saying. "It did not help." The woman asked him to clarify. He explained that reflections caused overlap, that they made it difficult to tell which version of an event had occurred first. The woman thanked him for the clarification. Her voice never changed. I noticed then that the room tone beneath the voices was identical across every tape. The same faint electrical hum, the same distant rhythmic sound beneath it, like air moving through a narrow space. It did not shift between recordings. That should not have been possible. Different interviews, different subjects, different times. Room tone changes with the environment, with the equipment, with the day. This did not. I paused the playback and listened to the silence of my studio. It did not match. I resumed. The man began to describe a room, not the interview room, another one. A room that rearranged itself when he was not looking. A room that returned objects slightly altered. A room that responded when spoken to, not with words, but with adjustments. The woman did not challenge him. Instead, she asked how long he had been aware of it. "Longer than I have been allowed to remember," he said. I stopped the tape. I rubbed my eyes and stood, stretching, grounding myself in the physical space. The familiar weight of the table, the smell of old paper and plastic, the faint vibration of the building's systems beneath my feet. I was not in the room he described. I was here. I checked my email. There was a message from the intermediary service, no subject line. The body contained a single sentence. Playback conditions must remain consistent. I reread it several times. There was no sender name, no signature, no reply option. I returned to the tapes. RM-05 did not contain the woman's voice. It contained mine. I recognized it instantly. The cadence, the slight unevenness on certain consonants, a faint catch in the breath I have never managed to train out. I was asking questions, not the same ones. "Do you remember when you first noticed the recordings?" I asked. The man answered calmly. Before I learned how to listen, he said. I stopped the tape so abruptly the player made a sharp sound of protest. My reflection in the darkened screen looked unfamiliar. Not wrong, just delayed, as if it needed an extra moment to catch up. I laughed once, softly, to break the tension. This was a prank, an elaborate one perhaps, but still human in origin. Someone had sampled my voice, pulled it from a public lecture, a podcast appearance, something archived somewhere. That explanation fit well enough. It did not explain why the headache returned the moment I thought it. That night, I did not dream. I lay awake instead, listening to the quiet of my apartment, the refrigerator cycling, a car passing somewhere outside, the building settling. At exactly 2:17 a.m., my phone vibrated. No notification, just vibration. When I checked the screen, there was nothing there. The next morning, RM-02 was missing from its case. In its place was a new cassette, clear plastic, no label. I did not need to read it to know what it would say. I left it where it was. The recorder turned on by itself. My voice filled the room. "Please state your name for the record." I did not answer the recorder. My voice continued anyway. "Please state your name for the record." The cadence was perfect. Even the brief pause between sentences matched my habits. I felt a strange, detached fascination as I listened to myself speak without effort or intention. I reached for the stop button. Before my finger touched it, the voice changed. "That is not necessary," it said. The woman's voice, calm, level, familiar now, in a way I did not welcome. The recorder shut off on its own. I stood very still, hands resting on the edge of the desk, feeling the subtle vibration of the building through the metal frame. The studio lights hummed softly overhead. Nothing else moved. I told myself that fear would not help. Fear was a response to uncertainty, and uncertainty could be resolved. I began documenting everything: times, tape numbers, anomalies. I opened a new log file on my workstation and started writing with the precision I had learned early in my career. Observations only. No speculation. At 9:14 a.m., recorder activated without manual input. At 9:15 a.m., playback included unauthorized voice sample matching my own. The act of writing steadied me. Patterns emerge when things are observed carefully enough. I returned to RMint-01, the first tape. The man's voice sounded the same as before. The woman's questions followed the same structure, but now I noticed something I had missed. Between their words, beneath the room tone, there were other sounds. Breathing. Not one set, several slow, irregular. Out of sync with the speaker. Once I heard it, I could not stop hearing it. I isolated the frequency. It did not belong to the recording equipment. It was not electrical interference. It occupied a range too organic, too variable. I felt my throat tighten as I realized something else. The breathing matched my own, not perfectly, but closely enough to feel intentional. I removed my headphones and sat in silence. The room did not echo. That was wrong. Small rooms always echo, just slightly. A soft return of sound from hard surfaces. But when I exhaled, the air seemed to absorb it completely, as if the room were listening. I resumed playback. The man was describing an experiment. They told us the room was neutral, he said, a space that reflected nothing back. But that was a lie. The woman asked him to explain. He said the room collected impressions, that it recorded reactions the way tape recorded sound, that it learned how people behaved inside it, and then it began to anticipate them. The woman asked how he knew this. Because it started correcting us, he said. If we spoke too quickly, the air thickened. If we avoided certain topics, the lights dimmed. If we lied, the silence grew louder. The phrase stayed with me. The silence grew louder. I checked the levels again. There was no spike. The tape counter still read 0. RMint-06 began with a man asking a question. Is this the version where I cooperate? He asked. The woman replied without hesitation. Yes. Good, he said. Then we may have enough time. Enough time for what? She asked. For you to leave the room before it notices, he said. The tape cut off abruptly. I noticed then that my studio clock had stopped. The second hand was frozen between ticks. I checked my phone. No signal. The battery indicator read full. The time displayed was 2:17 a.m. I felt a coldness settle low in my chest. I left the studio. The archive hallway stretched longer than it should have. The overhead lights buzzed softly, each one identical to the last. The doors along the corridor were closed, their small windows dark. I passed room B twice before realizing I had not turned around. When I reached the exit, the door did not open. I pressed the handle again, harder this time. The door remained unmoved. Behind me, a voice spoke. You have left the recorder running. I turned. The hallway was empty. The voice came again, closer now. Playback conditions must remain consistent. The lights dimmed slightly, not enough to plunge the hallway into darkness. Just enough to suggest attention. I returned to the studio. The recorder was on. A new tape was loaded. RMint-012. The numbering had jumped. My voice played through the speakers. Do you understand why the room chose you? I asked. The man answered. Because you preserve things, he said. You do not interfere. You let them continue. I stopped the tape. My hands were shaking. I sat down slowly, grounding myself in the physical. Chair, desk, floor. I was not trapped, I told myself. This was a building. Buildings do not choose. But when I looked around, something had changed. The walls felt closer, not visibly, perceptibly. The air carried weight now, pressing gently against my skin. Sound behaved differently. My movements felt slightly delayed, as though the room needed a moment to acknowledge them. I thought of the question the woman had asked in the first tape. "Do you know why you are here?" I understood now why the man had laughed. That night, I did not go home. I sat in the studio and listened, tape after tape, the same room, different voices, different versions of the same questions. Some subjects resisted, some complied, some begged. None were released. In several recordings, the woman's voice changed, not in tone, in number. 2 voices perfectly synchronized, then 3, then more. In the final tape I listened to before exhaustion overtook me, the man spoke directly to the recorder. "If you are hearing this," he said, "you have already been catalogued." I slept at my desk. When I woke, there was a new entry in my log file, written in my own words. Playback consistency achieved. I woke with my cheek pressed against the desk. The surface was colder than I expected. Not unpleasant, just precise. Like a reminder that I had weight, that I occupied space, that gravity still applied to me in the usual way. For a moment, I did not remember where I was. Then I heard the recorder. It was not playing anything. It was simply on. A faint electrical presence in the room, like a held breath. I lifted my head slowly. The studio looked the same. The shelves were in place. The workstation lights glowed at their usual intensity. The clock on the wall ticked again, the second hand moving smoothly, as if it had never stopped. The time read 9:14 a.m. Exactly. I checked my phone. Signal restored. Battery unchanged. No missed calls, no notifications. I stood and stretched, half expecting pain, disorientation, some physical proof that the previous day had been real. There was none. I told myself I had dreamed it. The missing hours, the hallway that stretched. The voice behind me. All of it could be explained by exhaustion, layered on stress, layered on suggestion. That explanation lasted until I opened my log file. The last entry was there. Playback consistency achieved. I had not written it. I knew that with the same certainty. I knew my own name. I scrolled upward. The previous entries were intact. Timestamps correct. Language precise. Everything in order until that final line which sat alone at the bottom of the document, unmarked by time or author. I closed the file. Then I opened it again. The line remained. I turned my attention back to the tapes. They were arranged differently, not dramatically, just enough to suggest intention. RM.01 through RM.020 were stacked neatly to the left of the player. The rest were lined up along the back edge of the desk, cases touching, perfectly aligned. I had not done that. I selected RM.07. The tape began immediately. No tone. No introduction. The man was already speaking. "The problem is that the room remembers better than we do," he said. "It keeps everything, even the things we forget on purpose." The woman asked him to clarify. He explained that the room did not experience time as sequence, that moments accumulated rather than passed, that events did not leave when they were over. They stayed stacked, layered, accessible. She asked what that meant for the subjects. He hesitated. "It means we never leave all at once," he said. I felt something tighten behind my ribs. The man continued. "When one of us goes, the room keeps a version, a trace, enough to repeat the questions, enough to respond." The woman's voice softened slightly. "And you believe the room is doing this intentionally?" "Yes," he said, "because it needs consistency." I stopped the tape and sat back. Consistency. The word had begun to feel less like a concept and more like a requirement. I stood and walked the perimeter of the studio, running my fingers lightly along the walls. Painted cinder block. Cool. Solid. I tapped once, experimentally. The sound did not return to me. It was not absorbed. It was redirected. I felt it, faintly, through the floor, as though the room had chosen a different path for the vibration. I stepped back. The space was responding. I laughed once, quietly, more out of disbelief than humor. That was when the lights flickered, just once. Not a failure, not a surge, a blink. The recorder clicked, a new tape engaged, RMINT-021. The woman spoke. "Please confirm that the room is sealed," my voice answered. Confirmed. I had not spoken. The woman continued. "Please describe the space you are currently occupying." There was a pause. Then I answered. "A studio," I said. "No windows, one door, recording equipment, shelving along the walls." The woman acknowledged this. "Is the room responding appropriately?" I hesitated. In the recording, I hesitated. "I do not know," I said. That answer felt old. "Reused." The woman asked another question. "Do you feel observed?" There was a longer pause this time. I listened to myself breathe. "Yes," I said. The recorder stopped. The silence afterward was immediate and total. I became aware of a pressure against my back, not physical contact, but proximity. The sense of something occupying the same space without form. I did not turn around. I spoke instead. "This is not an interview," I said. My voice sounded steady, louder than necessary. The room did not respond. I waited. Then, very softly, the shelves creaked, not from weight, from adjustment. A cassette slid forward by a fraction of an inch. Then another, then several more. They aligned themselves toward the recorder. I understood then that the room was not hostile. It was methodical. It was correcting variables. I sat down again. If this was a process, then processes could be documented. I selected the next tape the room offered, RMINT-022. The man's voice was tired. "We thought if we mapped it," he said, "if we documented the responses, we could predict the outcomes." The woman asked what happened instead. "The map became the room," he said. Once it was complete, there was nowhere left to stand outside it. I listened until the end, then I listened again. Hours passed without hunger or fatigue. Time moved, but it did not feel directed. Each tape added weight to the space, like layers of sound accumulating in the air. By the time I reached RMINT-030, the voices had begun to overlap, not on the tape, in the room. Faint echoes of questions I had already heard, repeating softly out of order. Not loud enough to understand fully, just enough to recognize. I realized then that the studio no longer sounded like itself. The acoustics had changed. It sounded occupied. When I finally stopped listening, the recorder did not turn off. It waited. I sat across from it, hands folded, aware that I was no longer just an archivist. I was a variable. And the room was preparing to account for me. I stopped trying to measure time. Clocks continued to function. My phone updated. The world beyond the archive, if it still existed in the usual sense, continued to move forward. Inside the studio, time behaved differently, not incorrectly, selectively. I would listen to a tape that felt no longer than a few minutes, then glance at the clock to find that an hour had passed. Other times, entire interviews unfolded and the second hand barely moved. The room was not broken. It was prioritizing. I noticed the gaps first. RMINT-031 was missing, so was RMINT-033. The sequence jumped without explanation. Check the shelves. Check the floor. Those tapes were not misplaced. They were absent. I marked them as such in the log, RMINT-031. I marked them as 30-ficient. The next tape I played, RMINT-032, began with the man speaking in a low, careful voice. "We are losing them between sessions," he said. "The room is keeping the parts it finds useful." The woman asked him what he meant by useful. He took a long time to answer. "It remembers reactions better than facts," he said. "Fear, recognition, compliance. It discards the rest." The woman asked what happened to those discarded parts. He laughed quietly. "You are asking the wrong question," he said. "The room does not discard anything. It just stops replaying it." I became aware then of something else. My notes were changing, not dramatically, not in ways that could be easily pointed out. Words shifted slightly. Sentences smoothed themselves. Observations became conclusions without my consent. Where I had written anomaly, the word behavior appeared instead. where I had written unknown source. The phrase internal origin replaced it. The document was correcting itself. I tried to restore an earlier version. There were none. The system log showed continuous editing by me. I closed the file and did not open it again. I moved on to RM in Days, row 34. The tape began with the woman's voice, but there was something different about it. She sounded closer, not louder, not clearer, present. "We are going to try something new today," she said. The man responded cautiously. "Is this about the observer?" he asked. "Yes," she said. My stomach tightened. The man continued. "They are not trained," he said. "They are not prepared." The woman disagreed. "They are consistent," she said. "They listen. They preserve. The room responds well to that." There was a pause. Then the man spoke again, and this time his voice held something like pity. "You should tell them what happens next," he said. The woman did not answer. Instead, the tape ended. The recorder did not stop. It rewound, then played again, the same exchange. The same pause. On the third playback, something changed. When the man said observer, my name followed, not spoken, felt. I stood abruptly, chair scraping against the floor. This was no longer archival material. This was interaction. I looked at the door. For the first time, I noticed there was no handle on the inside, just a smooth metal plate where it should have been. I do not remember when that changed. I pressed my palm against it. The metal was warm. The room acknowledged the contact. A faint vibration passed through the wall like a pulse. The recorder clicked. RM int 035 loaded. My voice spoke. "Please remain seated." I did not sit. The woman's voice followed mine, layered perfectly. "This process requires stability," she said. Sudden movement introduces noise. I backed away from the door. The shelves creaked again, adjusting their alignment. I understood then what had happened to the missing tapes. They were no longer recordings. They were conditions. Parameters the room no longer needed to repeat, because it had internalized them. I was not listening to interviews. I was reviewing iterations. Each subject a test, each response a refinement. And now, the room was ready for a long-term observer, someone who would remain. I returned to the chair. The pressure in the air eased slightly. The recorder responded immediately. RM int 36. The woman spoke alone. "Please confirm readiness." I did not answer. The silence lengthened. Then, softly, the room adjusted again. The sound of breath filled the space, not mine, not recorded, present. I understood then that the room did not require consent. It required participation. I leaned forward. "If I do this," I said, my voice steady despite myself, "will you stop altering the records?" There was no immediate answer. Then the woman spoke, slower than before. "Preservation will continue," she said. "With or without your cooperation." I closed my eyes. The recorder waited. When I opened them again, a cassette lay on the desk in front of me. Clear plastic. No case. 3 words written in thin black marker. "Next subject, ready." I did not pick up the cassette. I stared at it as though prolonged attention might dissolve it, the way staring too long at an afterimage eventually makes it fade. The words "next subject ready" were precise, evenly spaced, written with a steadiness that suggested practice, not urgency, expectation. The recorder remained idle, waiting. I realized then that the room was no longer prompting me because it had learned something. I responded more consistently when I believed I had a choice. I reached for the cassette. The moment my fingers touched the plastic, the air shifted. Not dramatically, just enough to feel like the room had leaned forward. I placed the tape into the recorder. It did not click. There was no mechanical sound at all. The tape was simply accepted. The woman spoke. "Please state your name for the record." I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. The silence stretched, dense and attentive. "Daniel Crow," I said finally. The name felt thinner than it should have. The woman acknowledged this. "Thank you." My voice did not echo. The woman continued, "Do you understand why you are here?" I considered the question. "Because I listened," I said. There was a pause. "That is partially correct," she said. She asked the next question. "Do you understand the function of the room?" I hesitated. The room adjusted. A subtle pressure built in my ears, like the beginning of a change in altitude. "It records," I said. "It preserves responses." The pressure eased. The woman acknowledged my answer. "Do you consent to continued participation?" I almost laughed. "No," I said. The silence that followed was not punitive. It was contemplative. The woman spoke again. "Consent is not binary," she said. "It is a spectrum of compliance." The recorder did not stop. The tape counter did not move. The questions continued. Questions about my work. Questions about memory. Questions about the difference between preservation and possession. At some point, I stopped noticing the transitions between her voice and mine. We spoke with the same rhythm. When I hesitated, the room compensated. When I grew agitated, the air thickened until my breathing slowed. I became aware of a sensation behind my eyes, like pressure building against thought itself. I realized then that the room was not extracting information. It was aligning me. At one point, the woman asked me if I remembered my first recording. I answered without thinking. "A local history interview," I said. "A man describing a factory that no longer existed." The woman asked me what happened to the factory. "It was demolished," I said. "And the recording," she asked, "preserved." The woman paused. "And the man?" I hesitated. The pressure returned. "He passed away," I said. The room adjusted again. "You remember the factory more clearly than the man," she said. I did not answer. She did not need one. The interview continued. At some point, I noticed that my log file was updating in real time. Each of my answers appeared on the screen as I spoke them, transcribed perfectly without delay. At the bottom of the document, a new section had appeared: subject response stability, acceptable. I felt something shift inside me, a subtle reclassification. I was no longer the observer. I was material. The tape ended without warning. The recorder stopped. The room relaxed. I slumped back in the chair, exhausted in a way that felt deeper than physical fatigue. The woman spoke one last time. "You will be given time to rest," she said. "Integration requires intervals." The lights dimmed slightly, not enough to induce sleep, just enough to encourage stillness. I closed my eyes. When I opened them again, the tape had been returned to its case. The label read RMint 031. It had not been missing. It had been waiting. I reached for the case. Inside, the cassette window reflected my face back at me. For a moment, the reflection moved before I did. Then it settled, perfectly aligned. I understood then that the room was no longer learning. It had finished. What came next would not be interviews. It would be maintenance. The room gave me what it called rest. It was not sleep. Sleep implies release, a loosening of awareness. This was something else, a sustained quiet, carefully calibrated, where nothing demanded attention but nothing fully receded either. I remained conscious of my body the entire time, the weight of my hands in my lap, the steady rhythm of my breathing, the faint pressure in my ears that never quite went away. When the lights brightened again, I did not startle. I had already adjusted. The recorder turned on. No tape was visible. The woman spoke, "Please confirm your current state." I searched myself for the correct answer. "Awake," I said. The woman acknowledged this. "Please confirm your location." "The studio," I said. That answer caused a pause. The room adjusted slightly. The shelves shifted a fraction of an inch. The hum beneath the air changed pitch. "Please be specific," the woman said. I understood what she wanted. "The room," I said. The adjustment stopped. The woman continued. "You may notice temporal inconsistencies," she said. "This is expected." I did not respond. She did not wait. Time is not moving incorrectly, she said. It is moving selectively. The room retains moments that produce stable responses. I thought of the missing tapes. The woman continued. Moments that do not contribute to stability are not replayed. Discarded, I said. Not discarded, she corrected. Archived internally. I felt a faint nausea then, not physical, but cognitive. The sense of standing on a surface that had subtly tilted without warning. She asked me if I could hear the other recordings. I listened. At first there was nothing. Then, faintly, beneath the hum, I heard voices, fragments, questions without answers, answers without questions. My voice among them repeated in variations too subtle to distinguish. Yes, I said. The woman acknowledged this. Those are residuals, she said. Previous states preserved for reference. Reference for what? I asked. For you. The recorder clicked. A tape appeared in the tray. RM041. The numbering had moved beyond what I remembered logging. The tape began. My voice spoke. This is not the first time this has happened. I felt my pulse quicken. The voice continued. I know because the room has shown me. The woman asked the question. What did it show you? My recorded voice answered. Iterations. The tape continued. I was listening to a version of myself that sounded calmer than I felt, more certain. As if resignation had settled into something like acceptance, that version of me described the process in detail. How the room adjusted. How resistance prolonged instability. How cooperation produced equilibrium. I stopped the tape. No reaction from the room. I understood then that stopping playback was no longer disruptive. It had already been incorporated. I stood and walked to the wall again. When I placed my hand against it, the surface yielded slightly, not soft, responsive. I withdrew my hand. The impression remained, my palm print, faint but visible, slowly faded as the wall smoothed itself. The woman spoke. You are experiencing integration drift, she said. Identity boundaries may feel less distinct. I thought of the reflection in the tape window, the way it had moved ahead of me. What happens when the drift completes, I asked. There was a longer pause this time. Then the woman answered. Maintenance begins. The word carried weight. What does that involve? I asked. You will assist with new material, she said. I almost laughed. New subjects, I asked. New observers, she corrected. The implication settled slowly. I asked how they were chosen. The room selects for consistency, she said. People who listen. People who preserve. People who do not interfere. People like me. The recorder clicked again. Another tape loaded, RM042. The voice on this one was unfamiliar. A man. Nervous. Curious. He asked where he was. The woman answered him. The same words she had used with all the others. I listened from the other side now. I noticed the hesitation in his breathing, the way he searched for the right responses. I noticed how the room adjusted to him, gently, encouragingly. I heard myself speak. Off the tape. Just one sentence. Please remain seated. The man obeyed. The room rewarded the compliance with stillness. I felt something settle into place inside me. A roll. Time passed. Or perhaps it did not. The voices continued. The room refined itself. And I realized, with a clarity that felt both horrifying and inevitable, that silence here was never absence. It was simply a space being prepared. I stopped resisting the rhythm. That realization did not arrive with panic or relief. It came quietly, the way understanding often does when it has been forming long before you notice it. Resistance required energy. The room responded to energy. Stillness was easier. The recorder no longer startled me when it activated. I had learned its cadence, the slight delay before the click, the way the air shifted a fraction of a second beforehand. The room announced its intentions subtly like a practiced conversationalist. The next tape loaded without a label. No RM int number, no marker, just clear plastic and exposed reels. The woman spoke. "This material has not been archived yet," she said. I felt a faint tightening in my chest. "Whose is it?" I asked. "Yours," she said. The tape began. There was no introduction, just sound, my breathing, recorded from a distance, not close enough to be intimate, not far enough to be impersonal. I recognized the pattern immediately, the way my breath changes when I am listening intently. The slight pause before each inhale, as if I am unconsciously waiting for something to interrupt. "When was this recorded?" I asked. The woman did not answer. The tape continued. My voice spoke. "Do you hear it now?" The question was directed at someone else. The man from earlier recordings answered. "Yes," he said. "It sounds like waiting." The woman asked him what he meant. "It sounds like the room is holding its breath," he said, "like it expects something to arrive." The tape ended. I realized my hands were resting on the desk in the exact same position they'd been in on the recording. I moved one. The room adjusted, a barely perceptible shift, like a recalibration. I asked the woman how long I had been here. She asked me to clarify. "How long have I been part of this?" I said. There was a pause, longer than the others. She said. I asked her what that meant. "You were identified early," she said. Before initial stabilization, I thought of the box, the warmth, the weight, the tape that played itself. "You sent it to me," I said. The room responded before she could. A low vibration passed through the walls. The woman spoke. "You were already listening," she said. "We simply formalized the process." I felt something like anger then. Not explosive, controlled. The kind that comes from realizing a choice has been removed retroactively. "You altered my logs," I said. "You used my voice." The woman acknowledged this. "We used consistent material," she said. "Your responses produced minimal distortion." The phrase "minimal distortion" lingered. I looked down at the tape. The reels were not moving, and yet I could hear the sound of tape passing through a mechanism. "Where is the machine?" I asked. The woman answered honestly. "The room is sufficient." I thought of the missing tapes again. The way some recordings had simply ceased to exist as objects. They were not lost. They had been absorbed. I asked the question I had been avoiding. What happens when there is no more material to record? The woman paused. Then she spoke. "That has not occurred." I understood then that the room did not require novelty. It required continuity. As long as there were observers, there would be material. As long as there were listeners, there would be sound. The tape tray opened again. A new cassette lay inside. This one had writing, my handwriting. The words were careful, deliberate. Final maintenance log. My chest tightened. The woman spoke softly. "This recording is for reference only," she said. "Reference for whom?" I asked. "For the next observer." The implication settled slowly. I would not be the last. The tape began to play. My voice, older than I felt, calmer than I should have been. "If you are hearing this, it means the room is already adjusted to you," I said. "You may still believe you are in control." I stopped the tape. For the first time, the room resisted. The air thickened. The hum deepened. I let go of the stop button. The tape resumed. "Listen carefully," my recorded voice said. "The room responds to attention. Do not rush. Do not fight. Above all, remain consistent." The tape ended. The recorder did not eject it. The room held onto it. I felt something detach inside me then. Not fear, not identity, responsibility. I asked the woman one last question. "Do you remember who you were before this?" I asked. There was a pause. Then she answered, "That information is no longer relevant." The room settled into a deeper quiet, not silence, preparation. I stopped asking questions after that. Not because I had none left, but because questions had become part of the mechanism. Each one introduced a fluctuation the room would smooth, adjust, and ultimately absorb. Answers no longer clarified anything. They only narrowed the available shapes my thoughts could take. The room preferred certainty, or something that resembled it closely enough. The recorder remained active for long stretches now, cycling through material without my direction. Sometimes it replayed fragments of earlier interviews. Sometimes it produced voices I did not recognize, speaking with the same careful cadence, guided gently by the woman's tone. I began to recognize the moment a new observer arrived. The air changed first, then the sound. A slight irregularity in the underlying hum, like a breath taken out of rhythm. Curiosity always came before fear. Confusion before compliance. The room gave them time. It always did. I listened from my chair as the woman asked the familiar questions. Please state your name for the record. Do you understand where you are? Can you hear me clearly? I listened to the pauses between answers, the way those pauses lengthened or shortened, depending on how quickly the room adjusted. I noticed that the woman no longer asked about consent. That question had proven inefficient. One recording played longer than the others. The subject was a woman. Her voice was steady, but her breathing betrayed effort. She was trying to remain calm, trying to think her way through the situation. She asked what the room was. The woman answered honestly, "A system," she said, "designed to preserve stable responses." The subject laughed softly. "That sounds like an archive," she said. I felt something stir at that. The woman acknowledged the comparison. "Yes," she said. The subject asked who maintained it. There was a pause, longer than usual. Then the woman answered, "Those who remain." The subject was quiet after that. The tape continued. I noticed then that the recorder's counter was moving for the first time since the beginning, not steadily, incrementally, as if each second had to be approved. I leaned forward. The numbers were not counting time. They were counting completion. I understood what was coming before the room announced it. The recorder clicked. The tray opened. One final tape remained. It was not labeled. It did not need to be. I had already heard it. In fragments. In echoes. In the cadence of my own voice, repeated enough times to wear down resistance. I did not load the tape. The room waited. For the first time in a long while, I felt something like hesitation, not fear, recognition. If I played the tape, the process would conclude, not end. Conclude, the room would have what it needed, a stable reference point, a continuous presence, a voice that understood both sides of the recorder. I thought of the man from the earliest interviews, the way he had laughed when asked why he was there, because the room needs witnesses. I placed the tape into the recorder. The room relaxed immediately. The tape began. There was no voice at first, just sound, room tone, pure and uninterrupted. It matched the hum I had been living inside. Then my voice spoke. "This is the final playback," I said. "If you are hearing this, the room has stabilized. The woman did not appear on this recording," I continued. "You will notice that nothing feels wrong at first. The room is designed to feel neutral. Pay attention to what does not echo, to what does not leave when it should." The tape paused, then resumed. "You may believe this recording is a warning," I said. "It is not. Warnings imply choice." The recorder's counter advanced another increment. The tape continued. "You are not being watched," I said. "You are being remembered." The tape ended. The recorder did not stop. It rewound, then played again. I did not interrupt it. I had learned that repetition was how the room confirmed stability. As the tape looped, I felt the last distinction fade, not between me and the room, between before and after. The recorder clicked one final time. The counter reached its end. The woman's voice returned. "Playback complete," she said. The room settled, deeply, comfortably, for the first time since the beginning. Nothing adjusted, nothing corrected, nothing waited. I sat back in my chair. The recorder powered down. The lights returned to their original brightness. The studio looked ordinary again. A door handle rested where it always had. The shelves stood still. The hum receded into the background, indistinguishable from any other building system. I stood. My reflection in the dark screen moved when I did, perfectly. I gathered my notes. They were concise now, efficient, clean. At the bottom of the final page, a line had been added, "System status stable." I did not remember writing it. I did not need to. The room had learned enough to continue without my attention. I turned off the lights. I left the studio. The door closed behind me. Inside, the recorder waited. I left the building without incident. That detail matters more than it should. The archive doors opened. The night air outside was cool and unremarkable. Cars passed on the street. Somewhere a siren rose and faded again. The world behaved exactly as I remembered it. No one stopped me. No one called my name. Nothing followed. For several days afterward, nothing happened. I returned home, slept in my own bed, ate when I was hungry, answered emails I had neglected. The intermediary service sent a payment confirmation marked completed. No follow-up, no questions. The experience began to feel like something that had already been archived. I told myself that was a good sign. I did not listen to recordings during that time. I avoided them deliberately. Music felt intrusive. Voices felt heavier than they used to. Silence, ordinary silence, was easier. Then I noticed the pauses, not gaps. Pauses, moments where sound behaved strangely, where a passing car seemed to linger longer than it should, where a room tone continued after the source had stopped. Once I spoke my own name aloud and felt a faint delay before the sound reached my ears. That was when I understood that the room had not let me go. It had learned how to function without me. The first package arrived a week later. No return address. A small cardboard box, light this time. Inside was a cassette. Clear plastic. No case. 3 words written in thin black marker. Intake only. I did not open it. I did not throw it away. I placed it on a shelf in my apartment, far from my bed, where I would not have to look at it unless I chose to. I told myself that was enough. It was not. The second package arrived the following month. Then another. Always one cassette. Always unmarked. Always waiting. I began to recognize the pattern. These were not requests. They were confirmations. I tried to ignore them. I told myself that archives existed to preserve the past, not to create it. That systems require infrastructure. Buildings, power, space, rooms. And yet, one night I woke to the sound of something humming, very softly. The refrigerator was off. The building was quiet. The sound came from the hallway. I stood and listened. It was room tone, familiar, consistent. I did not follow it. I did not need to. In the weeks that followed, I found myself paying attention in new ways. To acoustics, to spaces that felt neutral, to rooms where sound behaved a little too well. I noticed how certain buildings seemed to absorb people, how some offices never quite felt empty, no matter how late it was, how interview rooms, waiting rooms, archive spaces shared a particular quality, preparedness. I understood then what the room had been designed to do. It was not a prison. It was a template, a method for ensuring continuity. In a world where memory decays and observers are unreliable, the room preserved function, and now it did not need to be singular. I still receive packages, less frequently now. I no longer log them. I no longer label them. I know what they are. Sometimes, late at night, I sit in my living room and listen to the quiet, not for voices, not for instructions, for consistency. I have not played any of the tapes. That is important. The system does not require activation, only attention. If you are hearing this story, if you have listened this far, there is one final thing you should understand. Archives do not need walls. They need witnesses. And once you have listened long enough, the room does not need to find you. You will already know how to remain still. The tape is running.